Hopefully that give you a little bit of background. I have to slow down. I actually lived in Basingstoke now for just gone 21 years actually. So this is quite some time ago. But hopefully out of this you'll see some things that you can learn from, and I still need to learn an awful lot from this experience. But it's not a trophy. It's a well that I can draw strength from, because when the roof falls in life, it's not what's fallen down that matters, but what's left standing. And I'm only able to stand here today because of what God's done in my life. And I just want to give testimony to that today, and just to let you know a little bit of what happened to me and what I learned from this experience. And hopefully you'll find it encouraging, and maybe want to find out more if you're not a Christian. And if you are a Christian, maybe be encouraged to give thanks, because I certainly do when I look back on this. So we go back to 8th November 87. I'd just come up with my sister, was standing for the Remembrance Day service. This is quite a big thing in Northern Ireland because of the fact that Enniskillen had two regiments that fought in the First and Second World War, and also people who died as a result of the Troubles. So Remembrance Day is quite poignant for people in the town. And we were just gathering there, as we did every year. And I still remember everything that happened that day. You know, the jumper I was wearing, I had a brand new pair of shoes. I just remember looking at my watch, and literally, no sooner had I looked at my watch, as I said in the film, at 10:43, I heard something like I've never heard before. The noise was absolutely horrendous, and I just remember going forward. And just a split second it happened, I knew what it was, and it just went black. And then the next memories I had are actually being pulled from the rubble. And it was sort of a surreal feeling. I couldn't feel my left leg. I felt myself being lifted up by 4 members of the Territorial Army and the UDR. That was Tommy, the guy that dug me out, was one of those people. And really fascinating to listen to his story, because it wasn't until 10 years after the event that I actually learned that this huge slab of concrete that took 5 people to move, Tommy said it must have been held up by a single brick or something. I just couldn't believe that this slab was held up and he was underneath it. And it's just like unbelievable. You didn't know that detail. Yet looking back, it just to me shows me how close I was to death. There were people who were standing further away from the explosion than I was that were killed. Basically, a bomb was planted in the gable wall of an old building, and in front of that building was a metal railing, like a crash barrier. And a lot of people had gathered there to lean on that. And of course, when the building collapsed, large pieces trapped them against the railing, and many people were killed as a result of that. The chap you saw being dug out of the rubble at the very end of the clip of the bomb was standing nearby to where I was and suffered a severe brain injury, and thankfully has recovered since. There have been some amazing stories of people who have gone through this trauma in life, and it is quite amazing looking back on it. But I mean, it was complete chaos. I just remember being lifted out of the rubble and put my hand in my mouth and couldn't feel my front teeth had gone and couldn't open my eyes, and all I could hear was the screaming and the noise and taste the grit and the concrete and the blood in my mouth. And it was just really, those memories sort of stay with you. And the next memory I have is actually waking up in the hospital. Now, my father wasn't at the event. It was my sister and myself. My sister didn't sustain any injuries. She was blown clear by the force of the explosion, apart from a fractured skull. But it was just complete chaos because everybody was covered in dust. It was very difficult to work out who was injured and what their injuries actually were. But the injuries I sustained were very severe and needed some specialist treatment. People look at that image, they think, the injuries I suffered to my face. Basically, all the bones were impacted in my face. My nose was pushed in, my palate was split open. I lost 5 of my front teeth. And basically the bones were fractured below my eye sockets above and down the jaw. It really was a complete mess. I don't know whether it was the force of what was resting top of it, but more likely the weight of people standing on the concrete slab, because people were running over the top of whatever was there. People were being pulled out of the rubble and out of the pieces of masonry. So basically had to undergo a significant operation, but I just remember seeing my father's face because he nearly had to go through those that had died in the explosion looking for me. It was an hour and a half after the event before he found me. And I just remember seeing two things that day: his face and being airlifted in a helicopter to hospital in Londonderry, 65 miles away from Enniskillen. But those memories do stay with you. They don't go away. Then I had to undergo a 5.5 hour operation. It was more like 5 hours. And the surgeon came out in the middle of the operation and basically said to my dad, I don't know whether your son will pull through or whether he has the strength to pull through this operation. The next 2 hours will tell whether he will survive or not. So prepare yourself for the worst. Actually, when you look at those injuries, the most serious injuries were actually to my leg. And the radiographer, who was a friend of my mother, said, Norma, said, I hate to tell you this, but I can't see Stephen having his leg before the end of this evening because it had broken in 4 places and split right the length of the bone, and my foot had literally been snapped in half. It really was a mess, a jigsaw, for want of a better word, and needed 2 sets of surgeons, one working on my face and one working on my leg, to really put things right and to set the bones in place again. And then I was in intensive care for a week with two other friends who were injured in the explosion. And that was quite difficult on a respirator. It was quite painful. I remember one night when one of them nearly died. It was a horrendous experience. And it was a horrendous experience for my parents. I was 15 at the time. My sister was 13. And I was in the hospital and they came to see me for 5.5 weeks. 65 miles there, 65 miles back on roads like driving from Reading to Petersfield, if I could liken it to that sort of journey. It was country roads. It was difficult. It took a lot out of them, and it really spoke to me of just how much they cared for me, and I was really just touched by that. I think when I look back on that experience, I clearly had plenty of time to think about it. 5.5 weeks gave me plenty of time to think about why this had happened. And the questions started to come thick and fast, because as soon as a newspaper reporter got hold of this picture, the media descended on the hospital like a plague of locusts. So basically, they had a sign on the door, keep out, please do not enter under any circumstances. And they still kept coming in, and it had to constantly call to get people ejected from the room. I just couldn't cope with the noise and the tension, and it was quite draining. I basically was left. One of the greatest experiences is to realize just how helpless you are in an experience when something like this happens. So basically, I couldn't do a single thing for myself. My leg was up to my waist in plaster. I couldn't wash my face. I couldn't even go to the toilet. It was a very humbling experience, and it's a bit like life's a bit like an onion, and sometimes you need to strip away the layers to find out actually what's really on the inside. And I think out of this whole experience, the memories I bring from this will stay with me, but I think a very important thing, and this is what I'll say, that when a trauma occurs in your life, what you do with your memories and how you choose to respond will ultimately shape who you become. For those that are directly caught up in an event like this, it's not possible to no longer remember. Indeed, it's not helpful to expect of people that they should forget. But what we do with our memories changes and shapes who we are. And as I sat in hospital, I was a Christian at the time, and I'd become a Christian several years prior to this. And the question somebody said to me, if God really loved you, he would have stopped this happening. And that question never entered my mind once, because I thought, well, why would have God spared my life unless I had to learn something out of this whole experience? And I thought to myself, there is more to this than just I can see here and now. And what I couldn't understand, I just had to trust that God knew better and better than I did. I had to just trust that his plans and purposes were greater. And that was really brought home to me by a guy who came to see me. When I moved out of intensive care, he came to see me 2 days later, and it was a day after the funeral. His brother and sister had been killed in the explosion. He was a Methodist minister, and he came, and nobody else was with him. He drove all the way up, and in this little Bible was this verse, Romans 8:28, which I'll take out. And I really get a lot from this. If I had to say that one chapter really stands out, this does, in the Bible, and it really spoke to me. And we know in all things, not just some things, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. It goes on, we experience suffering, but no, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For nothing can separate us from him. For I'm convinced that neither death nor life, neither angel nor demon, neither present nor future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. And I thought, wow, here's a guy who's lost his brother and sister-in-law in the explosion. And I thought, he obviously has a deep found faith in his life. And I really began to search about what the Bible had to say, because I thought to myself, somebody's been here before and gone through worse pain than I have. And I began to really start to strip away and look at the Bible, because I had time in hospital. And this pensioner wrote me a letter, and in that letter were these verses which were really I found quite touching. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has trampled me in the dust. I've been deprived of peace. I've forgotten what prosperity is, so I say my splendor is gone and all that I'd hope from the Lord. Yet, this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I'll wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. And I thought, wow, that was written thousands of years ago. And here am I in the situation, and that just speaks to me that out of this, there is something greater. And somebody loves me more than can overcome what's happened to me. And I began to read the Bible, and the more I began to read it, the more I realized that actually Jesus had been there, and he had suffered terrible pain and suffering on a scale that was far greater than mine. So it gave me hope to realize that he had overcome that suffering. And that enabled me to say, well, not so much why did God allow this to happen to me, but more about what does God want me to do in response to this. Not that other people should expect of me to perform, not that I had to live up to any expectations. I just wanted to see what God was saying out of this whole experience to me. And it really just spoke to me of God's love through the people that came to see me in hospital and that prayed for me. Really amazing that I'm able to testify to God's healing power here today. It's just amazing, considering that my leg was going to have to be amputated, potentially. I could have died in the explosion itself. To have to come through that whole experience and to be able to stand here today is just amazing grace of God that I'm able to do that today. I'm just so thankful for that. And normally I've been in the past quite skeptical that God could heal people. Prior to this explosion, had severe problems with my leg at school, and went through 2 bone scans and 2 myelograms where they put fluid into your spinal cord and go through your nervous system, and they take x-rays. And they could not get to the bottom of this issue that was causing me to limp. It was like trapped nerve, but they couldn't see it was trapped. And this Christian guy said, do you want to be healed? And I was like, not so sure about this. Nothing to prove that it'll do anything. I suppose it can't do any harm. And he prayed for me, and it's just unbelievable heat went through my body and down my left side. And do you know what? Nobody got to the bottom of the pain, but that pain was gone within 3 days of that event. So before this whole experience, I'd experienced God's healing power. Yet I really wasn't prepared to live out what I believed. This experience completely changed that, because I thought, well, it's a testimony of what God's done in my life. It gives you hope when you're able to look beyond what you see with your eyes. You know, it's easy to just turn around and blame other people when things go wrong in life. And as I said, what we do with our memories is important. It doesn't mean that you don't feel angry when somebody's hurt you like this. And you know, when people came to interview me in hospital, I was dodging bullets. They said to me, "What do you think of the people that did this? Well, could you forgive them?" I said, "Well, I don't really know who they are to forgive." Well, if you did know them, would you forgive them? And yes, and then I pulled back and I said, well, it's not up to me to judge what they did. God will judge them on the day of judgment. But I dodged the question, and there's a lot of sensitivity because a lot of people were very hurt by what happened. A lot of people lost relatives in that explosion and suffered terrible injuries, and loss of limbs and sight in some cases. And it's difficult to be sensitive because it's difficult to explain to people why they were left the way they were. But I think what I was able to do was realize that actually somebody else had been there, and Jesus was able to demonstrate forgiveness in a way that I as a person couldn't do on my own strength. And I'll come on to that in a minute, but I'll just finish what I'm talking about. But yeah, give me faith to persevere that he'd been there. And it made me thankful, because when you cannot do anything for yourself, you realize what you rely or who you rely on in life. And I realized that actually I couldn't rely on my parents, couldn't rely on my own strength, my knowledge, wealth, anything. It was all stripped away from me effectively by walking through this experience. And I had to just trust God that in all things he did work for the good. And that taught me an awful lot and teaches me today that actually it doesn't matter who we are, what we have, or what we've done, or where we've been. God loves us so much. And his love is greater than the pain that we walk through in life. Pain does refine your faith. Peter talks about suffering all kinds of trials, and these have come to refine your faith. You know, a diamond is made in really high temperature, and it's refined. A pure diamond is formed under thousands of degrees of temperature. And it is a bit like that. When you walk through an experience like this, you are refined, you are changed. And I think I can look back on that and say that no pain, but no gain. And it makes you thankful. It makes you thankful for what you are, who you are, what you have in terms of your being, and that in fact you have life to live. And every day I live, I give thanks to God that I have that opportunity to live. It really was a near thing. The issue of forgiveness is one I returned to. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that actually what Jesus said, and this is like a key opening a lock, that you can hold on to anger and unforgiveness, but ultimately it will consume you. The emotion is natural, but to allow the emotion to control your thoughts, your mind, your being, your reaction to other people is wrong. And being a Christian helps me to recognize I'm human, but it helps me to realize that actually, how did Jesus deal with this? And I began to dig in and thought, do you know what? I actually found the passage where Jesus was being put on a cross, and he said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." And I thought, wow, if Jesus can forgive the people that are putting him to death, how much more can I forgive the people that did this, or ask God to forgive the people that did this? Because I began to realize that in some ways, the way God looked at me, I was no better than the people who did this. And that might seem rather reverse to you, me saying that. But it's a pass or fail. You either are 100%, you're able to do everything for God. Nobody's ever done that, right? Or you fall in one thing and you're as guilty to God as somebody who's done the things that these guys did to me. And really, when you begin to understand how God sees you as an individual, you judge other people less. And you learn to deal with emotion and work through things like anger, grudges, hurts in life, and be able to put them in context to realize actually there's more to life than that's what's happened. I can't explain everything that happens and why it has happened, but I know I can trust someone who's been there before. And forgiveness is a question I had to face. It was a response, not a retreat. You can't just walk away from these things. And I look at the example of other people who walked through this experience in Gordon Wilson, and I'll show a little clip of Gordon Wilson. Some of you may remember his daughter was killed in an explosion, and his wife, Joan, will speak on this clip. But I think this is amazing. If you just listen to this woman's words in the context of everything that she has suffered at the start and at the very end of the clip, this is not somebody who is governed by emotion or performance or a better person. She has a concrete faith in her life, and it's just quite amazing. So we'll play this little clip.
When the bomb happened, and the weeks and months after it, I didn't care whether I lived or not. And now, 10 years on, I give to God thanks for bringing me safely, for helping me to cope with the loneliness through the years. The doctor arrived at the bedside to say that Mary was very badly hurt. She was bleeding internally. Her pelvis was broken, and she was very, very ill indeed. And Gordon said, "You're telling us she's dying." And the doctor said, "No, as long as there is life, there is hope, and we're fighting for her life." She's been given blood, and we learned later she'd been given 24 pints of blood, but she was losing as fast as they were giving the blood to her. We were then brought up to intensive care because she was being brought from theatre, and Julianne and Peter and myself were brought into the room, and I was shocked to see my daughter, my healthy daughter, wired up and lying. Her eyelids blinked when I spoke. I think she may have known my voice. But Sister said to me, "You know, her heart is just beating." And I spoke to her, and Sister whispered, "Her heart has stopped beating." She had passed on.
I understand why on the one hand she was telling me she was all right, on the other hand she was screaming. When I asked her for the 4th or 5th time, she said, "Daddy, I love you very much." Those were the last words she spoke. I should never forget them.
You say that you bear no one any ill will. It must be very difficult for you not to feel bitter towards those who were responsible for leaving that bomb.
I haven't really had time to think of the wider implications. Certainly don't feel bitterness. People are surprised that I don't, but I don't. I prayed for them last night. Sincerely. And I hope I get the grace to continue to do so.
I received a phone call from Ingrid saying, "Granny, Peter's had an accident. He has collided with a lorry and he's not very well." And I just threw down the telephone. I screamed and I screamed. I ran upstairs along the corridor. I screamed. When I reached his home, I went in through the door, and the 2 little girls were lying roaring on a chair. And Ingrid, I turned to her and I said, "And what about Peter?" And she said, "He's gone." Pattern had repeated itself, and I just couldn't believe it. He left me peacefully. I felt his mission had been accomplished. I think he went into overdrive after Peter died. He had lost 2 children. He had worked as hard as he could for peace. He had seen the IRA. He had given of his time to young people and to peace and reconciliation. And I must say at this stage, I think God's timing is always best. And he, I think, thought he had enough.
It's difficult when people have to walk through that sort of pain and loss. But it's encouraging to know that their life is grounded on something much greater. And those words of Joan Wilson's, "I bear them no ill will, became the man who forgives." I think that was a leap too far for the media to have chosen. But I genuinely believe that Gordon meant that. And certainly his words saved many lives after the event, because there were people ready to take up arms in response and revenge to what had happened. And his words were like a calming balm on an angry situation. And whilst he was ridiculed by many people at the time for being insensitive, maybe because of their loss and pain, those same people will look back and I've heard them say, you know, what Gordon said transformed the situation. It could have been all sorts of things that had gone wrong. He faced off a lot of abuse and had to deal with a lot of pain through this whole experience. Gordon was a neighbour of mine. He lived 2-3 doors down from our house, so I knew his family well. He worked very hard as an Irish senator after the death of his daughter, and obviously you've seen the testimony of his wife on the loss of their son as well. But God's timing is always perfect, and in all things God does work for the good of those who love him. You know, in life we can't always explain pain and suffering. In fact, I can say from my own experience that sometimes things come in 2s and 3s. And there have been several events in my life when my father fell off a ladder and ended up in intensive care. I was doing work for the church. You know, why did God allow that to happen? I don't know. I can trust God because he knows best. The same day that we moved house, the removal company didn't turn up, and we exchanged and completed in the same afternoon. It was a horrendous day. Another day, when I was dismissed from my job, had a car accident, and my sister fell off a bus and broke her arm. You know, these things happen in life, disasters happen, but God's greater than these things. So I'd encourage you to look into this more, and if you want to come along to Alpha, I'm sure that God will speak to you as he's spoken to me through the Bible, because it's a wonderful book, and it's not always the easiest to understand, but God is great. Amazing. Thank you.